Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, Insights, Longer History. My name is Felicity, and I'm from the Audience Engagement team at the NGV, and will be your host for today's presentation. Ordinarily, we would begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne, and recognise the Wurundjeri Wurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the NGV is built. However, as we're coming to you remotely today, I'd also like to acknowledge that there are many other people present in today's talk who may be on the lands of other traditional custodians, and pay respect to those communities wherever they are as well. Our speaker today is Sophie Gerard, who is the Assistant Curator of Australian Painting, Sculpture and Decorative Arts 1980 at the NGV. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Felicity. Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. I hope you're all surviving lockdown and managing to find some little moments of calm and joy in your days. It's certainly Groundhog Day here in my home. Firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the city of Maribyrnong, where I live and work these days, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as any other Indigenous Australians who are with us today. An acknowledgement of country is where the idea of this element of the exhibition Show Can Sunlight came to fruition. The movement of Australian Impressionism is abundant with imagery of the Australian country. And with these images is a narrative that surrounds it of identity and land and country building. So for many Australians and for people that enjoy these works of art, the images within this movement and the exhibition specifically resemble typical Australia. Works such as The Pioneer and Shearing the Rams are a real nostalgic symbol of this country and are symbolic of the country's roots and history. So this narrative that is permeated around Australian Impressionism places the movement as growing in tandem with a national identity in Australia. And this is precisely what we wanted to tackle and problematize when I began writing this specific chapter of the exhibition's publication, A Longer History. So it's really important that I acknowledge and I pay my respects to the rightful owners of the lands, of all the lands depicted and spoken about in this exhibition and its publication alongside that. Australia's First Peoples are custodians of the oldest continuing culture on Earth, having thrived as owner-occupiers of the land for more than 70,000 years. By developing complex social structures and sophisticated farming, agricultural and fishing practices that wove together individuality, spirituality and a deep respect for the natural environment, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have maintained their cultural connections to the land and the waterways despite the devastation caused by colonisation. And the acknowledgement of Australia's shared history is central to the timeline of Australian Impressionism, and that's what I want to talk about today. It's actually far more interesting to see the movement as being birthed from a time of great change and political and social upheaval than it is to see it as the beginning of what is now considered to be a quintessential Australian culture, to frame it sort of in its much, much wider history. So the final 2 decades of the 19th century, when these Australian Impressionist artists began working, were a time of immense and fast-acting change in Australia. It was described as the golden age of national idealism. The 1880s and 1890s saw the country's population in pursuit of self-definition and self-understanding. The artists working at this time were entrenched in this discussion, and they were all aiming to develop a type of painting that they could really call their own, that moved away from the idealist landscapes produced by the predecessors of Impressionism in the country's colonial days, so artists such as Louis Bouvalot and Eugene von Gerard. This conversation was taking place actively and engagingly in literature and in the media, Writers such as Banjo Patterson were discussing Australia's new identity at the time. So artists, visual artists, really were on the ground and amongst these really big and important discussions. And this persistent association between artists who came to prominence during this time and a distinctive Australian art style ingrains the deep-seated and incorrect idea that Australian painting was the invention of the Australian Impressionists. And in fact, the thriving and dynamic art traditions of Australia's First Peoples had been established for millennia, that were interwoven throughout their culture as documentation for their stories and ceremony, and enriched by their intimate connection to country. Their visual expression took form in incised and ochred dot and line markings on multi-purpose tools and shields, figurative images on cave walls and rock cliffs, as well as ephemeral ground designs and body adornments, which were restricted to specific ceremonial contexts. And the visual expressions of diverse Indigenous cultural groups represent their inherited languages and encode the specificities of their places where they were living, and where their identities were based. So now this narrative of Australian Impressionism and Australian national identity being connected is one that has been pushed for centuries. In 1934, art historian William Moore, in his monograph Story of Australian Art, which was one of the first books like this of its kind, discussed two categories, what he called, of the nation's painters. The first, which he ironically calls Australia's first artists. He then goes on to describe these first artists as being the early pioneers from Europe and not Australia's first peoples. And secondly, the second category he describes as the Australian school, which he dates as beginning in 1885. And similarly, in 1945, Bernard Smith's Place, Taste and Tradition book, he chose the starting point as 1885 too as the starting point of his chapter of Australian painting, which he pointedly calls Genesis. So both of these chapters in these historical monographs really taking 1885 as the starting point of Australian national painting. Both of these authors chose this date, which marked the year that Tom Roberts travelled back from Europe to Australia. He had been there for around 6 years, studying and working alongside the European Impressionists, and he brought back these skills to Australia in 1885. So these authors have chosen this year as the origin of Australian painting. They're seeing it sort of as this marking point when the sunny south of Australia, in its whole, rugged and sunburnt glory, could then be captured with an appropriate degree of European influence. And although the 1880s marked a time when Australian Impressionism, this rich and highly pivotal movement in Australian art, did emerge, its role in developing national identity within this country is really what we must be calling into question here. This is largely because of its notable absences of women and, more blatantly, Australia's First Peoples. So for the first time in the nation's colonial history, the 1890s saw the native-born, non-Indigenous Australians, the sort of second generation of white Australians, and the first ones that had actually been born in Australia, they were beginning to outnumber the immigrant population, their parents' generations who had come to Australia on ships. They were beginning to outnumber this population. So the perception of Australia was actually transitioning at this time from a sort of geographical location of where you would go to home. And the country's centennial celebrations in 1888, a couple of years before this was its first national event, its national celebration. It actually also saw major industrial developments throughout the country's capitals emerge. The development of tramways, an underground sewage system, electric street lights, to just really name a few, libraries, hospitals, universities, these are all being built in the last few years of the 1880s. So there was this real heightened sense of patriotism in Australia's white population at this time. Furthermore, as the last of the nation's first generation of settlers were dying, um, an awareness of national history became apparent. And this sort of manifested in published memoirs at the time, books like Old Melbourne Memories, that was published in 1884, The Chronicles of Early Melbourne, that was published in 1888. These were books that were actually talking about the country's history, and these were the first time that these books were being published. So there was this real sense among white Australians of the country's past, but also its future and where they wanted to see themselves go. And although nationalistic pride was really prevailing at this time, the industrial developments within the nation's cities and towns brought with them also this collective nostalgia for the bush, which began to heighten Australia's mythicized affinity with characters such as the pioneer and the bushman, who really the country had sort of started to outgrow by this point with the development that was occurring in the cities. So from the late 1880s, writers such as Henry Lawson for media publications like the Sydney Bulletin, and this was a periodical that had a real widespread reputation for being a vehicle for a real distinctive brand of radical nationalism. They were being absorbed with the character of the Bushman as a symbolic icon for modern egalitarianism. And artists were being drawn to locate real Australia in their paintings at this time. They were looking to the country's interior, to the landscapes, all of these landscapes, which were then starting to be seen as showing a real point of difference to the cities and to also the landscapes that were being seen in Europe. They wanted to sort of get away from the corruption of city life that was sort of booming at this time. It was now starting to see crimes of theft and gangs and organized sex workers, all of these elements of cosmopolitan society that were really at odds with the rural lifestyle which came before in the previous generation. In 1889, another editor for the Bulletin, Fred Bloomfield, he wrote a piece that said that Australian painters need to find their inspiration in the bush, in the plains of the far west, and they need to be depicting the exciting scenes found on the cattle farms and sheep droving and camping, branding, boundary riding, gold mining. He sort of started to list these places that Australia's artists really should be starting to focus their search for imagery. So artists really started to look inland for their inspiration, and they started to heroize the sun-bleached wild landscapes. These were often in stark contrast to the impressionist depictions of very dreary city scenes that we do see at the time. The bush and the rural landscapes is always so sunny in Impressionism, but the city scenes are very often dreary and drizzly, like sort of London style paintings that were also coming out of Europe at the time. And these inland paintings started to provide a visual imagery to Australia's search for identity. So although the depiction of the landscape in the matter of artists such as Frederick McCubbin, Tom Roberts, Arthur Streeton is certainly distinctively Australian Impressionist in technique and palette, they're not distinctly Australian. So the visual representation of country formed an integral part of First Peoples' cultural and spiritual existence. William Barrack, he was born with the name Barrack on Wurundjeri country near present-day Croydon in Victoria in the 1820s. He was an artist and a Narangita, or a headman, whose art continues to communicate the significance and intricacies of Wurundjeri society. His great-great-niece, Joy Murphy Wandin, describes him as a man with a soft voice who could inflame the heart of anyone. Barrack lived at Corroboree Aboriginal Station from 1863 until 1903. where he became an influential spokesperson for the rights of his people. He forged diplomatic relations and led negotiations between white settlers and the Wurundjeri people, working to establish and protect the Aboriginal land rights of his community. And despite Barrack's enormous efforts, which actually at one point saw him walk around 60 kilometres from Corroboree to Melbourne to plead his case in Parliament, by 1893, over half of the area that where he lived was occupied, and by 1923, all of those still living at Corroboree were sent to Lake Tears. Barrack's work of around 50 known drawings survive, focus on the business of ceremony, and were driven by an imperative to record Barrack's country and culture, this culture that in reality at the time was hugely under threat. In his words, he said, "You got to know your father's country, and Yarra is my father's country. Me no leave it, my father's country. There are no mountains for me on the Murray." And as Aboriginal people fought for their right to survive on their land, Australia's rugged terrain became synonymous with a new type of national identity. And as Australian Impressionist paintings began to embody a turning point in the country, Barrack and his people were mourning the world that once was. The record left by Barrack visually documents intimate knowledge of his culture and the Nagi, or public ceremonies of the Wurundjeri people. The significance of this body of work is heightened by the restrictions at the time that were placed on the people of Corroboree by the Board of Protection of Aborigines, which forbade the practicing of culture, language, and ceremony. So Barrack and artists from these communities were producing works that showed these ceremonies as basically documentation that they existed, because they weren't allowed to practice these ceremonies at the time. So for this reason, these works serve as a cultural memory and a record of Wurundjeri life and tradition for his descendants. Most of Barrack's works show figurative dances, women, children, elders, and animals, such as this one here, group hunting animals. And these figures fill the pictorial space, and they're unimpeded by borders and a horizon line. So in these works, the viewing process is experiential. Ceremony and country are at once in front and beside and behind and under. And this is in real contrast to the work of the Australian Impressionists, where there's always the inclusion of a stark horizon line, which positions the landscape as something to be looked upon and admired, as opposed to experienced. And the absence of it in Barrack's work really amplifies this kinship between First Peoples and their land. It highlights the fact that for Indigenous artists, there is no separation between the land and the sky, or between artists' identity and their country. That artists really are at one with the land that they depict. The perpetual inclusion of a horizon line within Australian Impressionism, as with much Western-centred art, represents a key point of difference from the ways in which Australia's First Peoples resonate with the land. For Indigenous artist Brooke Andrew, he says the horizon line represents patriarchy. It represents dominance in the way of looking at other possibilities, at diverse cultural readings, dominance in women, at men, at the body, at human evolution, at animal evolution. Brooke Andrew says that the horizon line is an aspect of male conquest and dominance specifically. And that dominant position of artist over land renders country as other and restricts the viewer from reading the work from any alternative perspective. So from the perspective of the bird or the kangaroo or the sky or the sea. The horizon line shown even in Tom Roberts' A Breakaway and the glimpse scene in his work Shearing the Rams from 1890, these lines position the land as something to conquer and to take from it what we will. And this sentiment is actually echoed by Roberts in the shearing shed on Yorta Yorta country in Corroboree, where he described the sheep's wool being stripped from the sheep for man's use. The figure-dense compositions by Indigenous artists such as Barrack at the time served to highlight another commonality in Impressionist paintings, and this is the absence of Black people. Because the Impressionists were reacting to a call for artists to present on canvas this hero figure in the bushland, they really were centering their works on the heroic white male, really on men that resembled themselves. So Aboriginal people by this time were almost entirely invisible in Australian art, and their erasure from the lands on which they had lived for over 70,000 years really reflects this deception of terra nullius that was being perpetuated throughout society, and this dying race upon which Australia was being built. So much of the language disseminated throughout the media on First Peoples was entirely anthropological in nature, and it amplified the viewpoint that the traditional owners of Australia were on the brink of extinction. Robert's portrait of an Aboriginal man, this painting is called Aboriginal Head, Charlie Turner. This one here, he painted this in 1892, and it's in the collection of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This work was praised by critics at the time, and there's a quote from the Argus when they were talking about this work. They said that the work's value is going to grow year by year with the gradual disappearance from our midst of the original possessor of the soil. Thus, it has a permanent, if melancholy, interest, which justifies its inclusion in our national collection. Yet though Roberts's portraits were applauded, Roberts was the only Impressionist artist to ever depict people, Indigenous people in the landscape. So this work here, next, Corroboree, Murray Island, painted in 1892, this is the only work by an Impressionist artist to even show a glimpse of Indigenous people actually on their land. So this general invisibility of Aboriginal people helped to erase the less appealing aspects of colonial expansion from Australia's burgeoning national narrative. As art historian Virginia Spate has really noted well, she said that there could be no shadows in sunny Australia. This was a time when white Australians were trying to build this Australian dream narrative of their new identity, and Black Indigenous Australians really didn't have any place in this narrative. Instead, these paintings by the Impressionists focused on strong masculine labour, and although much of Australia's pastoral labour force at this time actually did comprise mostly of unpaid Aboriginal workers, artistic depictions were almost entirely of white men. In an article, again in the Argus in 1889, Roberts, Charles Conder and Streeton spoke about their quest for truth in the Impressionist movement. They said that we're going to do our best to put only truth down on our canvases, and only so much as we feel sure of seeing. So the erasure of Indigenous people in these works really calls this artist statement into question. While works by Indigenous artists such as Barrack provided proof of the existence of Aboriginal people at the time in the same areas that the Impressionist artists were painting in Victoria, and also this was a time when the future of Aboriginal people was so uncertain. So the proof of the documentation with works like Barrack's is so critical in the history of Australian art. White Australia's visual erasure of Aboriginal people provided this sort of out of sight, out of mind relief to contemporary society. So as an art movement, Australian Impressionism is hugely worthy of celebration. Its artists broke ground in presenting the Australian landscape in a way that was entirely different from what had come before, and they were promoting spontaneity and lucidity with their palettes and their brushwork. However, it is critical that the ongoing narrative that positions Impressionism as synonymous with Australia's national identity is interrogated. The excitement that reverberated at the turn of the century is completely understandable. Society was seeing this series of firsts, which in the mind of Australia's citizens, and we need to remember that Indigenous Australians were not seen as citizens at this time, these changes and developments were hugely beneficial. Society saw this society was seeing, the birth of galleries and hospitals and libraries and universities. So all really, really exciting changes that were happening within society. However, it's so important to acknowledge that these years were not occurring in a vacuum. In these same decades, Australia's first peoples were experiencing enforced and severe change as well. Laws legalising the forcible removal of Aboriginal people from their homelands and their placement into newly established missions, sweeping epidemics that were introducing diseases that killed thousands of Aboriginal people at a time, and these untold massacres that were occurring at the hands of the nation's settlers. These early decades of settlement have had devastating consequences for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which continue to shape the lives of Australia's Indigenous population today. So in this exhibition of She Oak and Sunlight, which unfortunately has now ended, but also in its publication, we really tried to contextualize the movement within the concurrent experiences of Australia's First Peoples and acknowledge their presence and boundless contribution to Australia's art history. In doing so, visitors and readers can gain a more accurate and vitally important picture of the societal circumstances from within which the Australian Impressionists were working. And in doing so, the complexities and richness of our nation's shared history can hopefully be more fully realised. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophie. That was such a fascinating way to spend lunchtime. I feel like I've learned so much. And thank you everyone who joined us today. It's great to have you here with us, even though it's virtual. For those who pre-registered, we'll be sending out a survey email and would love to hear your thoughts and experiences about today's program. And keep an eye on our website, on the NGV website, and on our social media accounts to see what we have coming up next. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon, and thank you, Sophie, again.
Thanks.